It was a typical morning in the quiet town of Riverbend. Nestled along the banks of a slow-moving river, the town had a charm that made it feel like time moved a little slower here. With tree-lined streets and locally owned shops, Riverbend was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and every face was familiar. For decades, its steady pulse had been set by the regular comings and goings of its residents, none more so than Frank Williams, an 89-year-old man who had called the town home for his entire life. Frank was something of a fixture in the community. Though he wasn't the kind of man to command attention with grand gestures or loud opinions, his quiet presence was well known. People in Riverbend respected Frank. He was the kind of man who always offered a polite greeting to his neighbors, tipped his hat to the postman, and sat patiently on his porch with his old dog, Sam, watching the world go by. To many, Frank represented something they valued deeply in this town: stability, routine, and the simple pleasures of life. Each day, without fail, Frank walked the same route through town. He passed the old barber shop, the hardware store, and the town's modest library, all on his way to the same destination, the corner cafe. The cafe had been around for as long as anyone could remember, and for as long as it had been there, so had Frank. Every morning at precisely 10:30 a.m., Frank would enter the cafe, exchange pleasantries with the regulars, and sit at his favorite table by the window. He always ordered the same thing: a ham and cheese sandwich on rye, with a small cup of black coffee. It wasn't much, but to Frank, it was a ritual that anchored his day. The corner cafe was more than just a place to get a bite to eat. It was the heartbeat of Riverbend. It was where the locals gathered, not just for the food, but for the sense of community that came with it. The cafe was small and cozy, with mismatched chairs and hand-painted mugs that regulars would claim as their own. There was a warmth to it, not just from the scent of freshly brewed coffee, but from the conversations that filled the air. Stories shared between neighbors, gossip exchanged over scones, and the laughter of familiar faces. The staff had always known Frank by name. In fact, many of them had grown up watching him sit at his window table, a symbol of the town's enduring spirit. There was Laura, the cafe owner, who had inherited the place from her mother, and Peter, the middle-aged waiter who had worked there since he was a teenager. But today was different. There was a new face behind the counter. Kyle, a young man in his early 20s, had recently started working at the cafe. He was new to town, unfamiliar with its rhythms and the importance of certain unwritten rules, like how everyone treated Frank with the utmost respect. Kyle wasn't a bad kid, but he was impatient, and the slow pace of Riverbend frustrated him. He had taken the job out of necessity, not passion, and he found the older regulars tedious, always ordering the same things and making small talk he didn't care for. He wasn't rude, but he lacked the warmth that the other staff members brought to their interactions. That morning, as Frank made his way to the counter to place his usual order, Kyle didn't recognize him. While everyone else knew Frank's routine, Kyle didn't. He saw an elderly man with slow movements and a soft voice, not the quiet pillar of the community that everyone else saw. Frank stood at the counter, waiting for his turn to order. The cafe was bustling as usual, with the regular morning crowd filling the tables. When it was finally his turn, Frank smiled politely and said, "I'll have my usual, please. Ham and cheese on rye, with a small black coffee." Kyle, distracted by the stream of orders, glanced at Frank with a look of confusion. "Your usual?" he asked, not bothering to hide the irritation in his voice. "We don't have any special orders for people." Frank, still polite, clarified, "I come in every day and order the same thing. Just a ham and cheese on rye." Kyle rolled his eyes and muttered under his breath, "Yeah, well, we don't do memory service here. You've got to actually order from the menu." A few of the regulars sitting at their tables heard the exchange and shifted uncomfortably. Frank, who wasn't used to such dismissive treatment, hesitated for a moment. He repeated his order, his voice a little quieter this time. "I'll just take the ham and cheese sandwich, on rye, please." Instead of taking the order, Kyle let out a small laugh, loud enough for others to hear. "Man, it's just a sandwich. You don't have to make it sound like a big deal." The comment stung. Frank, who had faced far more difficult moments in his long life, including serving in the military and raising a family through tough times, wasn't one to let things get to him. But this felt different. This was his town, his cafe, his routine. And here he was, being laughed at for something so small, so simple, yet so important to him. A heavy silence fell over the cafe. The regulars looked down at their plates, uncomfortable but unsure of how to intervene. Peter, the longtime waiter, stood frozen behind the counter, too shocked by Kyle's behavior to step in immediately. For Frank, the moment felt like a betrayal, not just by Kyle, but by the entire cafe. It was as if the sense of belonging he had felt for so long was suddenly stripped away in an instant. Without saying another word, Frank turned and quietly walked toward the door. The usual sound of his cane tapping against the floor was slower, more deliberate, as if each step weighed heavier than the last. The regulars exchanged glances, their faces reflecting the same thought. Did that really just happen? Frank had been coming to the cafe for longer than most people had lived in Riverbend, and not once had he left without his sandwich. But today was different. He didn't look back, didn't stop to explain. For the first time in decades, Frank left the cafe with nothing but a heavy heart. As the door closed behind him, the cafe seemed to exhale, but it wasn't a sigh of relief. It was the kind of quiet that follows an unexpected and painful blow. People resumed their conversations in hushed tones, unsure of what to do next. Kyle, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened, shrugged and continued taking orders, his mind already moving on to the next customer. But for everyone else, and especially for Frank, things had changed. The simple act of ordering a sandwich had become something far more profound, a moment of humiliation that would ripple through the community, changing things in ways no one could have predicted. The regulars sat in stunned silence, their faces mirroring a collective sense of guilt. Frank didn't deserve this. And though he didn't say it, everyone could see how deeply hurt he was. It was the kind of hurt that ran deep, that lingered long after the incident itself was over. The kind of hurt that makes you question everything you thought you knew about a place, a routine, and the people in it. The shock on their faces wasn't just about Kyle's rude behavior. It was the realization that they had all witnessed something sacred being broken, and none of them had done anything to stop it. Frank Williams had lived in Riverbend for nearly 9 decades, making him one of the oldest and most respected members of the community. His life had been a tapestry of quiet endurance, stitched together by moments of hardship and resilience. Born during the Great Depression, Frank's early years were marked by scarcity and struggle. His family had little, but they made do, and Frank learned early on the value of hard work and humility. When World War II broke out, Frank, still barely out of his teenage years, enlisted in the military. Like many young men of his generation, he served with bravery, but never spoke much about the things he had seen or done during the war. Those who knew Frank well would catch the occasional glimpse of the toll it had taken on him. An uncharacteristic silence when certain subjects came up, a faraway look in his eyes that spoke of memories he preferred to keep buried. Yet despite everything, Frank had returned from the war determined to live a peaceful life. He married his childhood sweetheart, Helen, and together they raised 2 children in a modest house on the outskirts of Riverbend. Over the years, Frank became known as the kind of man who didn't seek attention but quietly contributed to the community in countless ways. He worked as a mechanic at a local garage, fixing cars and keeping Riverbend running smoothly. His children grew up, married, and eventually moved away. But Frank and Helen remained in their small home, tending to their garden and enjoying the simplicity of life in a town where everyone knew your name. When Helen passed away a few years ago, it marked a turning point in Frank's life. After decades of companionship, Frank found himself alone. But he didn't wallow in grief, at least not publicly. He remained a steady presence in Riverbend, continuing his quiet routine, which now included daily visits to the corner cafe. To many, the sight of Frank sitting by the window at the cafe became a symbol of endurance. He didn't have much family left in town, but the cafe, and the people in it, had become his community. His daily trip for a simple sandwich and coffee was more than just a meal. It was his way of maintaining a connection to the world. Frank was respected, but not in an ostentatious way. His quiet dignity and unassuming nature earned him the admiration of the town, especially among the older generation, who remembered him not just as a war veteran, but as a man who had lived his life with grace. For the younger people in town, Frank was something of a mystery, a relic of a time that they could barely imagine. Still, even those who didn't know him well treated him with deference. The corner cafe was more than just a place to get food. It was Frank's last true connection to the social fabric of Riverbend. The corner cafe was, in many ways, the heart of Riverbend. It wasn't fancy or modern. Its wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of old leather from the worn-out chairs. But that was exactly what the locals loved about it. The cafe had been passed down through generations of owners, and each one had kept its spirit intact. A place where everyone was welcome, where you could sit for hours without being rushed, and where the coffee was always hot. For years, the cafe had been a gathering place for people of all ages. Older residents came in early in the morning to read the newspaper and chat about local events. Young families stopped by on weekends for pancakes and laughter. Students from the nearby high school often hung out in the afternoons, doing their homework or gossiping over milkshakes. The cafe's charm wasn't in its menu, but in the sense of community it fostered. Frank's presence in the cafe was part of its daily rhythm. The staff always greeted him by name, and regular customers knew to give him a nod or a smile when they saw him sitting by the window. He didn't talk much, but his quiet presence was felt by everyone. Laura, the cafe owner, had always made sure that Frank's sandwich was prepared just the way he liked it, and Peter, the longtime waiter, treated Frank with a kind of reverence that was rare these days. In many ways, Frank was a symbol of the cafe itself, enduring, steady, and an essential part of the town's identity. But in recent years, things had begun to change. A new generation of workers had started to take over the cafe. While Laura remained the owner, she had begun hiring younger staff to keep the place running, hoping to appeal to a broader, more modern crowd. The new workers, though competent, didn't have the same deep connection to the community that the older staff had. To them, it was just a job, a stepping stone to something bigger. This shift, though subtle, was beginning to erode the cafe's original charm. Kyle, the new employee, was the latest addition to the cafe's staff. In his early 20s, Kyle had recently moved to Riverbend from a larger city after dropping out of college. He was brash, impatient, and not particularly interested in the cafe or its patrons. To him, Riverbend was a temporary stop, a place to earn some money while he figured out his next move. Kyle's attitude didn't come from malice, but rather from frustration. He was dealing with personal issues that weighed heavily on him: strained family relationships, mounting student loan debt, and a lingering feeling of failure after leaving school. His frustrations bubbled just beneath the surface, making him easily irritated by the slow pace of life in Riverbend. To Kyle, the cafe's regulars were just part of the background, people who ordered the same thing day after day, reminding him of the predictability he so badly wanted to escape. Frank, with his slow movements and simple sandwich order, represented everything Kyle found frustrating about his new life. He didn't understand why people in Riverbend seemed so stuck in their routines, and in his impatience, he failed to see the deeper meaning behind those routines. Frank, to him, was just another old man with an order, not the war hero, not the grieving widower, not the pillar of the community. He was just someone standing in the way of getting through his shift faster. While Kyle wasn't deliberately cruel, his lack of empathy was clear. He was dealing with his own struggles, and those struggles blinded him to the impact of his behavior on others. Little did Kyle know, His brashness would soon have ripple effects far beyond what he could have imagined. Laura had owned the corner cafe for nearly 15 years, having taken it over from her mother when she retired. Laura had grown up in the cafe, watching her mother treat every customer like family. She had always wanted to keep that tradition alive, but running a small business in a changing world wasn't easy. In recent years, Laura had been under pressure to modernize, to bring in new customers, and compete with the chain coffee shops that had begun popping up in nearby towns. Hiring younger staff like Kyle was part of Laura's attempt to breathe new life into the cafe. She thought it would help attract a younger crowd, but deep down, she worried that something important was being lost. The older staff members, like Peter, understood the cafe's role in the community. They knew the regulars by name, knew their stories, and treated them with a care that went beyond customer service. But the new hires, they just didn't get it. And Laura, overwhelmed with the daily tasks of keeping the cafe afloat, didn't have the time to oversee everything as closely as she once had. On the morning of Frank's humiliation, Laura had been in the back office, handling paperwork and inventory. She had no idea what had transpired between Kyle and Frank at the counter. If she had been there, she would have stopped it immediately. But by the time she emerged, Frank was already gone, and the atmosphere in the cafe had shifted in a way she couldn't quite place. Unbeknownst to Laura, the incident between Kyle and Frank would soon come to her attention, and when it did, it would force her to make some difficult choices about the future of the cafe and her responsibility to the community that had supported her for so long. The next morning, for the first time in years, Frank didn't show up at the corner cafe. His usual spot by the window, always occupied by him at exactly 10:30 a.m., remained empty. The familiar sight of his cane leaning against the chair, his quiet presence sipping coffee while watching the world outside, was conspicuously absent. It was a small but significant disruption in the daily rhythm of the cafe, and it didn't go unnoticed. The regulars exchanged concerned glances, whispering among themselves. Peter, the longtime waiter, immediately felt a sense of unease as he wiped down the tables. He had worked at the cafe long enough to know that Frank's routine was unshakable, even in the face of illness or bad weather. Something was wrong, and deep down, Peter knew it had everything to do with what had happened the day before. Frank, the stoic man who had endured more in his lifetime than most could imagine, was deeply affected by the incident. At home, he sat in his favorite armchair, staring blankly out the window, replaying the moment in his mind. It wasn't just the rude words that stung. It was the lack of recognition, the feeling of being invisible in a place that had once felt like his. The cafe had been his sanctuary, a small but cherished part of his day where he felt seen, where he was more than just an old man with a sandwich order. Now it felt tainted. For the first time in decades, Frank considered never going back. He had endured humiliation in silence, the weight of it pressing down on him more heavily than he'd expected. He had faced war, loss, and hardship, but this small act of disrespect felt personal in a way that unsettled him. He was left wondering if the world had moved on without him, if there was still a place for someone like him in a town that was changing faster than he could keep up. As word spread about the incident at the cafe, Riverbend found itself divided. Small towns have a way of amplifying stories, and soon everyone knew what had happened, or at least their version of it. Some were outraged on Frank's behalf. The older generation, in particular, couldn't believe that someone like Frank, who had lived in the town longer than many of them had been alive, had been treated with such disrespect. They saw it as a symbol of everything wrong with the younger generation: the lack of manners, the disregard for their elders, and the erosion of basic decency. People began talking at the hardware store, in the aisles of the grocery market, and outside the post office. "Did you hear what happened to Frank?" became a common question. Outrage simmered beneath the surface, especially among those who had known Frank for years. A few of the regulars, old friends of Frank, decided to confront Kyle directly. One morning, they approached him at the counter, their faces tight with anger. "How could you treat Frank like that?" One of them demanded. "Do you even know who he is? He's been coming here longer than you've been alive." Kyle, leaning casually against the counter, shrugged. "It's not that big of a deal," he muttered. "He asked for a sandwich. I made a joke. If he can't take it, that's on him, not me." His dismissive attitude only fanned the flames. The group walked out, muttering about how things were different when they were young, how respect for your elders used to mean something. But not everyone saw it that way. Some of the younger residents, though sympathetic to Frank, saw the incident as a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. They thought the older folks were overreacting. After all, Kyle was just a kid, new to town, and probably stressed. To them, it was just a moment of rudeness, not the symbol of a generational shift that the older residents were making it out to be. As the town gossiped, tension built, and the divide between the generations grew wider. What had started as a simple misunderstanding in a cafe was now a reflection of deeper issues within the community, issues of respect, change, and how different generations viewed the world. Meanwhile, Kyle's personal struggles were getting worse. He had hoped that moving to a small town like Riverbend would be a fresh start, a place where he could get his life back on track. But instead, he found himself feeling more trapped than ever. The slow pace of the town, the repetitive routine of the cafe, and the constant reminder that he didn't really belong all weighed on him. At home, his relationship with his parents had deteriorated further. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was tense and filled with disappointment. Kyle's decision to drop out of college and move back home was something they couldn't accept, and he felt their silent judgment every day. His financial situation wasn't helping either. The bills were piling up, and the cafe job, though steady, wasn't enough to make a real dent in his debt. All of this pressure began to manifest in his behavior at work. Kyle became more impatient, snapping at customers for the smallest things, making mistakes, and showing up late. Laura, the cafe's owner, noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The warmth that had once defined the cafe was slowly being replaced by a sense of unease. Regulars weren't staying as long, and the usual friendly chatter had become more subdued. She knew something was off, but couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. As the tension in town grew, a local town leader, known for his diplomacy, suggested that Kyle make a public apology to Frank. He reasoned that an apology could smooth things over, heal the rift in the community, and help restore the cafe's reputation. Word reached Kyle, and for a moment, he considered it. But the more he thought about it, the more resentful he became. Why should he have to apologize? He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. Frank was just being sensitive, and everyone else was blowing the whole thing out of proportion. When the suggestion was brought up to Kyle directly, his response was curt. "I'm not apologizing," he said firmly. "I didn't do anything wrong. If Frank feels hurt, that's on him, not me. People need to stop making such a big deal out of nothing." His refusal to apologize only deepened the divide. For the older residents, it was further proof that the younger generation had no respect. For some of the younger residents, it was a sign that Kyle was being unfairly singled out and made to carry the weight of the town's frustrations. In the midst of all the back and forth, something unexpected happened. Frank spoke up. He hadn't intended to get involved in the town's gossip, and he certainly didn't want to be at the center of the brewing storm. But as the tension escalated, Frank felt compelled to say something, not for himself, but for the sake of the community he loved. At a town meeting where the incident had become a topic of discussion, Frank stood up, his old frame still strong but his voice soft. The room fell silent as he spoke. "I don't need an apology from anyone," Frank said, his eyes scanning the room. "What I want, what we all deserve, is respect. Not just for me, but for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're old or young, rich or poor. We all deserve to be treated with decency." The room remained silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Frank's message was clear. It wasn't about a sandwich or a joke gone wrong. It was about something deeper, about how the town treated one another, about the values they shared. His words resonated with many, cutting through the noise and bringing a moment of clarity to the conflict. For some, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of what they had always loved about Riverbend. For others, it was a challenge, a call to reflect on their own actions and attitudes. The fallout of that single moment in the cafe was far from over, but Frank's quiet strength had shifted the conversation. It was no longer about who was right or wrong, but about how the community would choose to move forward together. The next steps, both for Kyle and the town, remained uncertain, but the tension that had built was now accompanied by a new question. What kind of place did Riverbend want to be? Several days had passed since Frank had last set foot in the corner cafe. His absence had not gone unnoticed, and whispers about what had happened continued to ripple through the small town of Riverbend. Regulars who had once shared the morning hours with Frank at the cafe couldn't help but feel the void left by his absence. The usually warm and inviting atmosphere of the cafe had turned colder, tinged with an undercurrent of unease. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it. But on a crisp Wednesday morning, the familiar sight of Frank walking down the street toward the cafe brought a hush over those who noticed. His pace was a little slower than usual, his posture a bit more hunched. He carried the same quiet dignity he always had, but there was something different in his expression, something resolute. As he opened the door and stepped inside, the soft chime of the bell over the entrance seemed louder than ever. The usual clatter of dishes and conversations died down almost immediately. Eyes followed him as he made his way to the counter. Though no one dared speak, Frank's return had been long awaited, but it was not one that filled the cafe with joy. It was laden with tension. Kyle stood behind the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, his face impassive. He had heard the talk around town, had felt the cold stares of the regulars who no longer greeted him with a smile. But despite the growing tension, Kyle had refused to admit that what had happened with Frank was anything more than a minor misunderstanding. To him, it was just an overblown incident that would eventually fade, like so many other small-town dramas. When Frank reached the counter, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. The regulars looked on, waiting to see what would happen next. Laura, the cafe's owner, stood in the back, silently observing. She had been out of the loop when the initial incident occurred, but had since come to understand the gravity of what had transpired. And yet she wasn't sure what to do about it. Kyle cleared his throat as Frank reached the counter, but the words that came out were far from genuine. "Hey, Frank," he said, his tone indifferent. "Look, sorry about the other day. No hard feelings, right?" It wasn't an apology. It was a formality, an empty gesture meant to smooth things over without any real acknowledgement of the hurt that had been caused. Kyle's eyes didn't meet Frank's. He couldn't grasp the significance of what this moment meant for the town, or for Frank. The cafe fell silent. The regulars shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flickering between Frank and Kyle, waiting for a response. For a long moment, Frank said nothing. He stood there, his weathered hands resting on the counter, his eyes fixed on Kyle. There was no anger in his expression, no bitterness, just a quiet resolve that spoke louder than words. When Frank finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of his years and the wisdom they had brought him. "I don't want an apology," he said, his voice steady. "What I want is respect, for myself and for everyone who walks through these doors. Dignity isn't something we should have to ask for. It's something we all deserve, no matter who we are or how long we've been here." The words hung in the air like a quiet rebuke. The regulars sat frozen, processing what Frank had said, while Kyle shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, it seemed like Kyle was beginning to understand that this wasn't about a simple sandwich order or a moment of rudeness. It was about something much deeper, about the values that held the community together, about respect and decency in a world that sometimes forgot those things. But the realization, though dawning, came too late. Frank took a deep breath, as if he had been carrying the weight of those words for days. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. His cane tapped softly against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the silence of the cafe. He didn't stop to look back, didn't pause to see the reactions of those around him. He simply left, quietly, but with finality. It wasn't just a departure. It was a goodbye. The regulars watched in stunned silence as Frank stepped out of the cafe and disappeared down the street. For decades, he had been a constant presence in that space, a living part of the cafe's history. His simple daily routine had been a symbol of stability, of the enduring spirit of the town. But now, with that single, quiet act of walking away, he signaled the end of an era. The decision to leave the cafe for good wasn't just about one moment of humiliation. It was about a lifetime of dignity, and the realization that once that dignity had been undermined, there was no going back. Frank, who had spent his life standing quietly on the sidelines, had made a life-altering decision to step away from a place that no longer felt like home. For the town of Riverbend, the loss was palpable. The cafe, once a place of warmth and familiarity, now felt hollow without Frank. The regulars, many of whom had known him for years, felt the weight of his absence in a way they hadn't expected. It wasn't just that Frank had stopped coming. It was the knowledge that something irreplaceable had been lost. As the days passed, the fallout from Frank's departure became clear. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted dramatically. Regulars who had once filled the tables in the mornings no longer lingered as they used to. Some stopped coming altogether, finding the cafe without Frank a little less welcoming, a little less like home. The conversations, once lively and filled with laughter, grew quieter, tinged with an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. Laura, the owner, was devastated. She had built the corner cafe on the values her mother had taught her, values of community, kindness, and respect. But now, she could feel those values slipping away. She knew that Frank's absence was more than just the loss of a customer. It was the loss of a vital part of what made the cafe special. She regretted not stepping in sooner, not seeing the signs of the tension building between Kyle and the regulars. Kyle, too, began to feel the weight of what had happened. At first, he had brushed it off, convinced that it wasn't his fault, that Frank and the regulars were overreacting. But as the days went on, and as more and more customers gave him cold looks or stopped coming altogether, he began to realize that his actions had consequences. The indifference he had shown toward Frank wasn't just a mistake. It had caused real harm. Kyle's struggles outside of work didn't improve either. His personal problems, already piling up, felt heavier now. He hadn't meant to drive Frank away, but he had. And though he didn't fully understand the depth of the loss, he could feel the shift in the air every time he walked into the cafe. Frank's quiet departure had left a wound in the fabric of the community, one that wouldn't easily heal. The cafe, once a symbol of the town's close-knit spirit, now felt fractured. Laura, the staff, and the regulars all knew that things had changed, and that there was no going back to the way things were. And Frank, he had found peace in his decision. Though it was difficult to leave behind a place that had meant so much to him, he knew that he had done the right thing. He had spent his life carrying himself with dignity, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him, not even in a small-town cafe. In the days that followed, Frank returned to his usual routine, minus the cafe. He walked the same streets, visited the same shops, and greeted the same neighbors with a polite nod. But something was different now. He had drawn a line, one that the town of Riverbend would remember for a long time to come. The cafe had lost more than just a regular customer. It had lost a piece of its soul. The corner cafe, once the heart of Riverbend, began to wither in the wake of Frank's quiet departure. In the days and weeks that followed, the absence of Frank seemed to cast a shadow over the cozy establishment. It wasn't just the empty seat by the window that was missing. It was the sense of continuity and connection that had once given the cafe its soul. The regulars who had always found comfort in the daily routines and familiar faces started drifting away. Some stayed home, while others found new spots to gather. No one said it outright, but the unspoken understanding was clear. The cafe was no longer the same. Laura, the owner, was the first to notice the change. In the beginning, it was subtle. A few customers skipping their usual morning visits, a group of retirees who would typically chat over coffee for hours, now leaving after a quick cup. But as the weeks wore on, the trickle became a steady decline. The regulars, those who had given the cafe its warmth and life, were disappearing. Laura tried to bring them back. She introduced new menu items, extended discounts, and even redecorated in hopes of drawing in younger crowds. But none of it worked. The problem wasn't the food or the decor. It was the atmosphere, the intangible sense of belonging that had been fractured the day Frank walked out. Her efforts to modernize the cafe had backfired. The younger staff members, like Kyle, didn't have the connection to the community that the older staff had nurtured. And now, with the cafe's reputation tarnished by the incident with Frank, the few remaining regulars were beginning to lose faith in the place they had once considered their second home. Laura spent long hours in the back office, staring at the books, trying to figure out how she could keep the cafe afloat. Business had never been booming, but it had always been steady, until now. The realization that the cafe's survival was tied to the delicate web of community relationships hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't just a business, it was a lifeline for the people of Riverbend. But that lifeline had been frayed, perhaps beyond repair. For the first time since taking over the cafe from her mother, Laura considered the unthinkable: closing the doors for good. While Laura wrestled with the future of the cafe, Kyle was facing his own internal struggle. At first, he had brushed off the fallout from the incident with Frank, dismissing it as an overreaction by a few overly sensitive regulars. But as the days passed and the cafe grew quieter, Kyle could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. The cold stares from the remaining customers, the hushed conversations that stopped when he walked by, and the growing tension between him and the other staff members were impossible to escape. The weight of it all started to press down on him. Kyle had never intended to hurt anyone, let alone someone like Frank, who had done nothing but order a simple sandwich. But the truth was, Kyle had been too caught up in his own frustrations to see the impact of his behavior. His personal struggles, his strained relationship with his parents, his mounting debt, his feelings of failure had clouded his judgment. In his impatience and bitterness, he had lashed out at someone who had done nothing to deserve it. One evening, after closing up the cafe, Kyle found himself sitting alone at one of the tables, staring at the empty chair where Frank used to sit. The silence of the cafe, once filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, now felt heavy. For the first time, Kyle began to truly reflect on what had happened. He realized that his behavior had been a reflection of his own unhappiness, his inability to cope with the pressure he was under. But now, it wasn't just him who was suffering. The entire cafe, and by extension, the town, had been affected by his actions. Kyle knew he had to do something. He couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but he could try to make amends. The question was, would the town, and more importantly, Frank, be willing to forgive him? While the cafe struggled, Frank continued his quiet life in Riverbend, though now without the familiar comfort of his daily visit to the corner cafe. He didn't speak much about what had happened, but the town spoke for him. Word of the incident spread beyond the cafe's regulars, and soon, everyone in Riverbend knew the story of how Frank had been treated. To many, Frank became something of a local hero, a symbol of the dignity and respect that they all valued, but sometimes took for granted. People began reaching out to Frank, offering support in quiet but meaningful ways. Neighbors dropped by to chat with him on his porch, bringing over small gifts or invitations to join them for meals. Shopkeepers in town, who had always known Frank as a steady customer, made sure to greet him warmly whenever he stopped by. It was as if the town, recognizing the wrong that had been done, collectively decided to show Frank the respect he deserved. But Frank didn't let the newfound attention change him. He was still the same quiet man he had always been, content with his routine and the simple pleasures of life. However, there was an undeniable shift in how people saw him. His decision to walk away from the cafe, a place that had been such a central part of his life, resonated with many in the town. It wasn't just about the cafe. It was about the importance of standing up for one's dignity, even in the face of small, everyday indignities. Frank's quiet stand became a symbol for the older generation, particularly the elderly residents of Riverbend, who often felt overlooked or disrespected in a world that seemed to be moving too fast. In a way, Frank had become a reminder to the town that respect wasn't just about grand gestures, but about the small moments, the everyday interactions that defined their community. As the story of Frank's departure from the cafe spread, the town found itself divided. On one side were those who believed that the incident had been blown out of proportion. To them, it was just a misunderstanding, a moment of rudeness that didn't warrant the fallout that had followed. These residents, mostly younger, saw Kyle as a scapegoat for the frustrations of an older generation that was resistant to change. They argued that the cafe couldn't be expected to cater to the needs of a single person, no matter how respected. On the other side were those who saw the incident as a symbol of something much larger, a sign that the town was losing its values. The older generation, in particular, saw what had happened to Frank as a reflection of a broader shift in society. They felt that the respect and decency that had once defined Riverbend were being eroded, replaced by a faster, more impersonal way of life. To them, Frank's departure from the cafe wasn't just about a sandwich. It was about the loss of community, of the small acts of kindness and respect that made their town special. As the debate raged on, Laura found herself at the center of it. She had tried to stay neutral, to keep the cafe running despite the tension, but it was becoming clear that something had to change. The cafe, once a place of unity, was now a symbol of division. And Laura, who had inherited the cafe from her mother, with the hope of keeping its legacy alive, was beginning to wonder if it was even possible anymore. One late evening, as Laura sat alone in the back office of the cafe, surrounded by invoices and paperwork, she found herself facing a difficult decision. The cafe, her family's legacy, was no longer what it used to be. Business was dwindling, the regulars were disappearing, and the community that had once held the cafe together was fracturing. She had done everything she could think of to save it, introducing new items, trying to appeal to different demographics, but nothing had worked. The truth was, the heart of the cafe had been tied to the people who gathered there, and without them, it was just another coffee shop. And now, with Frank gone, it felt like the cafe had lost its soul. Laura considered the unthinkable, closing the corner cafe for good. It wasn't a decision she took lightly. The cafe had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. It was where she had grown up, where she had watched her mother serve customers with a smile and a kind word. It was where she had built her own life, hoping to continue the tradition. But maybe the time had come to let it go. Maybe the town had changed too much, and the cafe's time had passed. As Laura stared at the empty cafe, she realized that closing the doors would mean more than just the end of a business. It would be the end of an era for Riverbend, a sign that the town was no longer the place it used to be. But was that something she was willing to accept? The decision loomed over her, heavy with the weight of her family's history and the community's future. The weight of what had happened to Frank gnawed at Kyle, pressing down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As time passed, it became clear that the ripple effects of his behavior had gone far beyond the cafe. His casual dismissal of Frank's request wasn't just a one-off mistake. It had shaken the foundation of a community that thrived on respect, understanding, and mutual care. Kyle had been struggling with his own issues when the incident occurred, but he now realized that his personal frustrations were no excuse for how he had treated Frank. The town's response to the fallout, the cold stares from regulars, and the growing distance between himself and the other employees all forced him to confront his actions. As he reflected on what he had done, Kyle came to the difficult but necessary conclusion. He needed to apologize, not just to clear his conscience, but to truly make amends. One chilly autumn afternoon, Kyle found himself walking toward Frank's small house on the outskirts of town. His heart pounded in his chest, not from the cold, but from the nervous anticipation of what he was about to do. Kyle had never been one for emotional conversations, but this was something he couldn't avoid any longer. When he arrived at Frank's porch, he hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Frank was sitting in his usual spot, quietly watching the world go by, just as he had done so many times before. His dog, Sam, lay at his feet, and the slow creak of the porch swing was the only sound. Kyle cleared his throat and spoke, his voice shaky but sincere. "Frank, I came to apologize. I know what I did was wrong, and I didn't understand how much I hurt you. I let my own problems get in the way. And that's no excuse. I'm really sorry." Frank looked at him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness, just a quiet understanding that came from a lifetime of experience. He nodded slowly and motioned for Kyle to sit beside him on the porch swing. "You know, Kyle," Frank began, his voice steady, "respect is something that should be given freely. It's not something you earn after a mistake. It's something you offer from the start. We all have our struggles, and I get that. But no matter what we're going through, treating people with kindness and dignity should always come first." Kyle felt a knot form in his throat as he listened to Frank's words. He had expected anger, perhaps even rejection, but instead he was met with compassion. It was a humbling moment, one that forced him to reevaluate not just how he had treated Frank, but how he had been approaching life in general. "Thank you for your apology," Frank continued. "I accept it. But remember, this isn't just about me. It's about how we treat everyone, whether they're regulars at a cafe or strangers passing through." Kyle nodded, feeling the weight of Frank's words settle deep in his chest. It wasn't just about making things right with Frank. It was about making a change in himself, about being someone who treated others with the respect they deserved, regardless of the circumstances. As Kyle left Frank's porch that day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he was determined to make things right moving forward. He returned to the cafe, where the atmosphere was still tense, but there was a growing sense that something needed to change. Laura, having struggled for weeks with the cafe's decline and the division in the town, decided it was time to take action. Inspired by Frank's words and the community's need for healing, she came up with an idea to bring everyone back together. She announced a community day of the cafe, an event dedicated to celebrating the values that had once made the corner cafe a beloved gathering spot: respect, kindness, and inclusion. It would be a day where old and new customers could come together, share stories, and reconnect. The focus, Laura explained, wouldn't be on honoring any single person, but on fostering the kind of community where everyone felt welcome and valued. Frank, of course, was invited as a guest of honor. But true to his humble nature, he politely declined. "This isn't about me," he told Laura when she extended the invitation. "It's about the town, about the people who come in here every day. Focus on them. Build a place where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. That's all the honor I need." Though Frank didn't attend the event, his presence was felt. On the day of the community day, the cafe was filled with laughter, conversation, and a sense of renewed hope. Kyle worked alongside the other staff, greeting customers with genuine warmth, and making sure that every person who walked through the door felt welcomed. The regulars who had stopped coming returned, and new faces appeared, curious about the cafe that had become the talk of the town. In the weeks that followed, the corner cafe began to transform, not just physically, but in spirit. Laura made a point to foster an environment of inclusivity and respect, ensuring that every customer, no matter their background or age, was treated with care. She brought back some of the older staff who had left and hired new employees who shared her vision for the cafe's future. Kyle, now fully aware of the impact his actions had on the community, took it upon himself to become an advocate for treating customers with respect. He worked hard to earn back the trust of the regulars, and over time, they began to warm up to him. Kyle's journey of redemption wasn't easy, but he approached it with sincerity and a newfound sense of responsibility. The cafe itself became a symbol of the town's resilience. It wasn't just a place to get coffee. It was a space where people from all walks of life could gather, share stories, and feel like they belonged. The lessons learned from Frank's departure became a guiding principle for how the cafe operated, and the atmosphere of warmth and respect returned, stronger than ever. Even though Frank no longer visited, his influence remained a guiding force. The cafe had become a better version of itself, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. The town of Riverbend had been shaken by the incident, but it had also grown because of it, learning the importance of small acts of kindness and the power of community. The video ends with a quiet scene of Frank walking through town, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. He passes by the cafe, but he doesn't stop. He glances at it briefly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips, but then he continues on his way. The cafe had transformed, but Frank's journey had taken him elsewhere. He didn't need to return. His actions had already left a lasting mark on the community, and that was enough. As Frank disappears down the street, the screen fades to black, and a final thought-provoking question appears. What does respect mean to you, and how do we ensure we show it to everyone, no matter their age? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The video encourages viewers to reflect on their own experiences, to consider how small moments of kindness, or the lack thereof, can have a profound impact on the people around them. The story of Frank, Kyle, and the Corner Cafe serves as a reminder that respect isn't something that can be earned or negotiated. It's something we all deserve, and something we all have the power to give. The cafe may have transformed, but the real transformation was in the hearts of the people who learned what it truly meant to belong to a community that valued respect above all else.